When most people think about the Islamic Golden Age, the mind instantly goes to breathtaking advancements in science, mathematics, architecture, and literature. History books proudly tell us about scholars translating ancient Greek works, astronomers mapping the heavens, and mathematicians laying the foundations for algebra. But buried beneath this celebrated narrative is a darker, rarely told side of history, one that deals not with learning and culture, but with conquest, coercion, and the systematic destruction of entire peoples. What you are about to hear isn't drawn only from the writings of Islam's critics, it comes directly from the accounts of Arab chroniclers themselves. Their own words document policies and practices that shaped the medieval world and erased entire civilizations from the map. This was conquest on a level far beyond the battlefield. It wasn't just about taking land, it was about breaking the spirit of the conquered so completely that recovery became almost impossible. One of the clearest examples of this was the infamous Ottoman devshirme system known in the West as the blood tax. Under this system, Christian families in the Balkans were forced to surrender their sons to the Sultan every few years. Ottoman officials would arrive in villages, inspecting boys between the ages of 8 and 18, selecting those with the greatest physical strength and sharpest intellect. For the parents, it was a nightmare they could neither avoid nor resist. Refusal often meant death for the entire household. Once chosen, the boys were taken from their homes forever. They were marched to Istanbul, forcibly converted to Islam, and placed into an intense program of military training. From that day forward, their native languages, their faith, and even their names were stripped away. Speaking their mother tongue or contacting their families was forbidden. The most promising recruits became janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry corps, feared across Europe and the Middle East. But their transformation wasn't purely physical. The Ottomans employed brutal psychological tactics. Boys were told their Christian families had abandoned them, and that only the Sultan had rescued them from ignorance. They were given new loyalties, new identities, and a new history, one in which their past was something to be forgotten. Many grew to genuinely believe they owed everything to the empire that had enslaved them. The scale of this operation is staggering. Historical records suggest that between 1365 and 1826, when the system was finally abolished, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million Christian boys were taken. Entire communities lived in constant fear of the next collection. The cruel irony, these stolen children were often used as the very soldiers who would conquer more Christian lands. Former Christians turned into the instruments of their own people's destruction. This wasn't just military strategy, it was psychological warfare on a generational scale. By taking the strongest and brightest sons, the Ottomans ensured that resistance would crumble not just physically, but mentally. Families developed desperate strategies to protect their children. Some injured their sons to make them unfit for selection. Others hid them in remote areas during collection periods. But the Ottoman system was efficient and relentless. Once a boy was identified, escape was almost impossible. And while this might be one of the most infamous examples, it was far from unique. The Islamic slave trade as a whole spanned over 1,400 years, more than 3 times longer than the Atlantic slave trade, from the 7th century until the early 20th century. Millions were captured and transported across the Islamic world. Conservative estimates suggest 11 to 17 million Africans were enslaved, though the real number may be far higher. The Atlantic trade was horrific, but the Islamic trade introduced a particularly cruel twist: systematic castration of male slaves. Between 80% and 90% of boys intended for Islamic markets were castrated either before transport or upon arrival. The procedure was incredibly dangerous, with a mortality rate of roughly 90%. For most, it was a death sentence. Those who survived became eunuchs, stripped forever of the ability to have families or children. These weren't small, isolated operations, they were industrial in scale. The main castration center in Aswan, Egypt, processed thousands annually. The policy wasn't accidental. Islamic law allowed for the freeing of slaves, especially those who converted to Islam. By ensuring that slaves could not reproduce, rulers maintained a constant demand for fresh captives while preventing the rise of a large, self-sustaining slave population. Female slaves faced a different but equally devastating fate. The most beautiful were sent to harems for sexual use, while others were put to work in domestic service. Unlike in the Americas, where slave families could sometimes form and grow, Islamic slavery was designed to prevent any lasting slave community. Another notorious system, the Mamluk institution, took young boys mainly from the Caucasus and Central Asia, converted them to Islam, and trained them as elite warriors. Over time, these Mamluks became so powerful that they overthrew their own masters and ruled Egypt and Syria for more than 250 years. But even in power, they maintained the same system that had created them, continually importing new slaves rather than allowing their own children to inherit positions of authority. The economic consequences for the regions targeted were catastrophic. Entire areas of Africa were depopulated by slave raids. The endless cycle of warfare and abduction crippled local economies, making development nearly impossible. In some places, the damage was so deep that recovery never came. Arab chroniclers like Al-Tabari and Ibn Battuta wrote about these practices with chilling normality. Slave markets, castration centers, and mass raids were simply part of the economic and social order to them. This wasn't extraordinary, it was routine. But the brutality didn't stop at slavery. The caliphates also developed legal and financial systems to crush non-Muslim communities without technically forcing conversion. Under the dhimmi system, Christians and Jews were allowed to live under Islamic rule, but only as second-class citizens. The infamous jizya tax was deliberately set so high it could bankrupt most families, often amounting to several months' income. Paying it wasn't just expensive, it was humiliating. Collection ceremonies were staged to degrade the payer, sometimes forcing them to kneel or be struck before handing over the money. This was conquest not just of the sword, but of the spirit. The jizya tax was only one tool in a much larger strategy. The Islamic caliphates understood that money alone could break communities, but destroying the foundations of their culture and religion would erase them forever. Take Egypt, for example. When Arab forces conquered the land in 641 AD, they began a centuries-long campaign against the Coptic Christian Church. Monasteries and churches weren't just houses of worship, they were centers of education, libraries, and vaults of ancient Egyptian knowledge. When these institutions were destroyed, the knowledge they held, some of it going back thousands of years, vanished with them. The pattern repeated itself across the empire. When Persia fell, Zoroastrian fire temples, some that had burned continuously for over a millennium, were extinguished. Religious texts were burned. Priests were executed or pressured to convert. Within a few centuries, a religion that had once dominated the Persian Empire was reduced to a scattered minority. In India, the campaigns of Mahmud of Ghazni between 1000 and 1027 AD brought destruction on a scale few regions had ever seen. His chroniclers bragged about the number of Hindu temples destroyed, over 50,000 by some accounts. Millions were forced to convert at sword point. One of the most shocking acts was the demolition of the Somnath Temple, one of Hinduism's holiest sites. Its sacred fragments were used as building material for a mosque, a deliberate act of psychological warfare. These were not random acts of vandalism. They were calculated moves designed to prove the impotence of other gods and the supremacy of Islam. Conversions often took place in the ruins of destroyed temples, driving the message home: your faith is gone, your culture is defeated, and resistance is pointless. Even when religious communities were allowed to exist, their freedom was strangled by law. Christians and Jews were forbidden from building new churches or synagogues. They couldn't ring bells, carry weapons, ride horses, or testify against Muslims in court. These restrictions created a system of legal apartheid that made non-Muslims perpetual outsiders in their own homelands. Over centuries, the results were devastating. Ancient Christian communities in North Africa, once vibrant centers of theology, disappeared completely. The Zoroastrians of Persia, who had once numbered in the millions, dwindled to less than 200,000 worldwide. In many cases, only scattered villages or small diaspora groups remained to remember the faiths and cultures that had once shaped entire civilizations. But perhaps the most personal, intimate form of domination came through sexual slavery. The harem system, often romanticized in modern imagination, was in reality a vast network of exploitation. It wasn't just about the pleasure of rulers, it was a political weapon. A means of breaking conquered peoples by taking their women. Harun al-Rashid, the famous Abbasid caliph celebrated in the Arabian Nights, kept a harem of over 2,000 women, many of them captives from across the empire. They were bought, stolen, or taken as war prizes. Their lives depended entirely on the whims of the ruler. When Baghdad fell to the Mongols in 1258, the last Abbasid caliph's harem still contained more than 700 women. Many were murdered or assaulted as the city burned, a brutal end to centuries of institutionalized sexual slavery in the capital. Under the system of concubinage, female slaves had no legal rights. They could be bought, sold, or gifted like livestock. Any children they bore were considered illegitimate, unless officially recognized by the father, recognition that was rare. Slave markets in cities like Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad openly displayed women for inspection. Travelers like Ibn Battuta recorded seeing women stripped naked so potential buyers could judge their beauty and youth. The most attractive fetched prices equal to years of wages for skilled laborers. The psychological effect on families in vulnerable regions was severe. Parents knew their daughters could be taken at any time. Some deliberately scarred their daughters' faces to make them less appealing to raiders. Others kept them hidden indoors, creating a culture of seclusion for women that has echoes in some parts of the Middle East today. This demand for young, attractive women created a constant cycle of raids and abductions, and like wives, concubines were replaced as they aged, ensuring the need for fresh captives never ended. The demographic toll was enormous. Whole generations of young women were removed from their communities. The Ottoman Empire alone is estimated to have enslaved over 1.5 million women for sexual purposes between the 14th and 19th centuries. They came from the Balkans, the Caucasus, Africa, and Central Asia, each woman representing a stolen piece of her culture's future. Religious law offered justification. Quranic verses referring to those whom your right hand possesses were interpreted as granting a man unlimited sexual access to female slaves. Islamic jurists wrote entire legal codes regulating the purchase, sale, and sexual use of these women, presenting it as a divinely sanctioned practice. The long-term effect on conquered societies was devastating. By removing their women, the caliphates not only attacked the present but crippled the future. Families couldn't form. Cultural traditions often passed down by mothers were interrupted or lost entirely. In many cases, the damage was permanent. But domination wasn't just about people, it was also about the land itself. The caliphates mastered economic warfare as a tool of control. The goal wasn't merely to extract wealth, but to destroy a region's ability to sustain itself independently. The Khoraj land tax imposed on conquered territories could consume half or even 4/5 of agricultural output. Farmers barely had enough to survive. Those who couldn't pay lost their land, which was handed over to Muslim settlers or converted into waqf religious endowment property under Islamic control. In Persia, after the Umayyad conquest, the highly advanced Sasanian irrigation systems were allowed to fall into ruin or were intentionally destroyed. This was no accident, it was calculated policy to ensure the land would never return to its former strength without Arab oversight. Tribute demands weren't always about goods. In some cases, they demanded people. The Nubians, for instance, were required to deliver 400 slaves annually to the Fatimid Caliphate. The Bulgars had to provide young men for military service. These human tributes drained local populations while supplying the caliphates with a steady stream of labor and soldiers. Trade was tightly controlled to enforce dependency. Non-Muslims faced restrictions on the types of businesses they could operate and were often taxed at higher rates. Over time, this shifted economic power into the hands of Muslim merchants and left non-Muslim communities impoverished. The pattern was consistent: weaken the economy, control the land, dominate trade, and keep communities so dependent that rebellion would be suicidal. In some regions, once thriving cities and fertile lands became poor backwaters within a generation of conquest. The message was unmistakable: resistance would not only be crushed militarily but strangled economically until it was no longer even a possibility. The caliphates understood something that many conquerors throughout history missed: armies can break walls, but to truly dominate a people, You have to erase their identity. And they pursued that goal with cold, calculated precision. The erasure began with culture. In conquered territories, Arabic was imposed as the official language of administration, education, and religion. It wasn't just a matter of communication, it was a deliberate replacement of history. Over time, native tongues were pushed out of schools, banned in government records, and discouraged in public life. Eventually, they disappeared from daily use altogether. In Egypt, the Coptic language, directly descended from the language of the pharaohs, survived only in church services before fading entirely from everyday life. In Persia, centuries-old Pahlavi was driven out of official use. The new language became not only a tool of governance but a carrier of Islamic theology and worldview. By changing the language, the caliphates reshaped the way conquered peoples thought about themselves. Alongside language came the renaming of geography, cities, rivers, and regions that had carried their names for thousands of years were suddenly given Arabic names. This wasn't a random administrative decision, it was a symbolic act of erasure, a way of cutting people off from the memory of their pre-Islamic past. Religious festivals and cultural traditions faced the same fate. The Persian New Year. Hindu festivals were prohibited in conquered Indian territories. Local customs, dances, and seasonal rituals that had bound communities together for generations were outlawed. By erasing these traditions, the caliphates broke the emotional and spiritual continuity of their subjects. Monuments and architecture suffered an equally systematic attack. Temples, palaces, and statues from pre-Islamic civilizations were torn down or converted into mosques. The intent was clear: to make the past invisible. If the people had no physical reminders of their heritage, it would be easier to convince them that it never truly mattered or never existed at all. Centers of learning were prime targets. Libraries, universities, and archives that preserved centuries of accumulated knowledge were destroyed. When Arab forces took Alexandria, they finished what earlier disasters had started, obliterating what remained of the legendary library. In Siphon, the Sasanian capital, royal archives containing centuries of Persian literature, science, and philosophy were burned. The destruction was not random, it was systematic. Anything that preserved the memory of an independent cultural identity was considered dangerous and expendable. Education systems were completely restructured. Traditional schools were replaced or transformed into madrasas focused primarily on Islamic theology and law. The teaching of local histories, philosophies, and sciences that didn't align with Islamic doctrine disappeared. This meant that new generations grew up knowing almost nothing of their ancestral heritage. The results were irreversible. Ancient Egyptian civilization, which had survived the Persian, Greek, and Roman empires while retaining its unique character, was gone within a few centuries of Arab conquests. Zoroastrian Persia, once a powerhouse of art, literature, and philosophy, was reduced to a faint cultural echo. Civilizations that had endured for thousands of years vanished so completely that archaeologists today are still uncovering lost cities, texts, and artifacts, pieces of a history deliberately buried. What makes this even more striking is the efficiency of the process. This wasn't a chaotic wave of destruction. It was organized, calculated, and maintained over generations. The caliphates combined military conquest, economic suffocation, social engineering, and cultural erasure into a single, self-sustaining system of domination. It worked so effectively that in many cases, the descendants of conquered peoples eventually identified more with the conqueror's culture than with their own ancestral past. They adopted the language, celebrated the conqueror's holidays, and told the conqueror's version of history, often without realizing how much had been lost. The sheer scale of human suffering is hard to grasp. Millions were enslaved. Millions more were killed in wars, raids, and massacres. Families were shattered, communities emptied, and entire nations stripped of their future. Ancient religions, Christian, Zoroastrian, Hindu, and many others, were reduced to scattered minorities or erased entirely from their homelands. The psychological dimension of this conquest may be its most enduring legacy. By breaking the will of the conquered and replacing their culture with the conquerors, the caliphates ensured not just obedience, but loyalty from future generations. This was conquest that didn't need constant policing because the conquered themselves had been reshaped to think like subjects of the empire. Sexual slavery, forced conversions, economic destruction, and cultural erasure weren't random byproducts of war. They were deliberate policies. Policies that worked together to remove any possibility of resistance physically, economically, and spiritually. The historical record is clear. From North Africa to the Middle East, from the Balkans to India, Islamic caliphates built one of history's most comprehensive systems of conquest and control. And the cost was nothing less than the disappearance of entire civilizations. When you study these patterns, you begin to recognize echoes in the modern world. The tools may have changed: bombs instead of swords, propaganda instead of temple burning, but the goal is the same: erase alternative ways of life and replace them with a single dominant ideology. The difference is that in the medieval period, the methods were brutally: open armies marching in daylight, slave markets in public squares, entire libraries going up in flames. Today, erasure can happen quietly in schools, media, and laws. Until one day people wake up and realize that the language, traditions, and freedoms their grandparents took for granted are gone. The story of the Islamic caliphates isn't just a chapter of medieval history, it is a warning. Civilizations don't disappear overnight. They fade when their foundations, language, culture, economy, and faith are chipped away piece by piece. And once they're gone, rebuilding them is almost impossible. The ruins we dig up today, the ancient scripts we decipher, the scattered records left in foreign archives, these are the last whispers of worlds that were deliberately silenced. The loss is incalculable. The lessons are eternal. If history has one consistent truth, it's this: cultural destruction is the surest form of conquest. Armies may win battles, but when you erase a people's memory, you win forever. If you enjoyed this story and want more just like it, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Thanks for watching.